This is our stair-tailored PD session on DBI, and this is actually a case example today of what DBI might look like for a particular teacher. So we'll go through this case example. I'll illustrate the basic steps of DBI. If you need a refresher on those basic steps, you might go to our other stair-tailored PD on DBI essential steps. We'll go through the basic steps. We'll talk through using an actual case example. So the first step in the DBI process is establishing that there's a Tier 2 validated intervention program in place. To illustrate that, let's think about Taylor, who's a 6th grade student in Mr. Klein's mathematics class. For the past 3 months, Mr. Klein's been utilizing strategic grouping to meet the needs of small groups of students. So in your classroom, this strategic grouping might be part of a workshop approach, for instance, where you're pulling back some students to either work on enrichment or intervention. In Mr. Klein's classroom, Taylor is part of a small group that's been receiving additional practice on a validated computer-based intervention. This has been occurring 3 times a week for 20 minutes each session. Mr. Klein is hoping that this will enhance Taylor's progress toward mathematics proficiency in his classroom. So the next step is to progress monitor to determine whether that instruction and intervention is working, in this case, for Taylor. So there is a step of establishing a present level, setting an ambitious long-term goal for Taylor, and then Mr. Klein collecting frequent assessment data and using decision rules to determine whether that instruction and intervention is effective for Taylor. So as part of that small group intervention that Taylor's been receiving, Mr. Klein has Taylor take a weekly algebra progress monitoring measure similar to the APRM measures that your students are currently using on the computer. Mr. Klein sets a goal for Taylor using established benchmarks from the computerized system. So there might be, for instance, beginning or end of year, middle of year goals that are set for Taylor and for the other students as part of that computerized system. Mr. Klein actually sets that baseline score using Taylor's median score. So he gave 3 different measures, and then he took the median score to set up that baseline for Taylor. Then Mr. Klein graphs weekly scores and examines the data to see if Taylor's profiting from instruction and intervention being delivered. We should take a look at what that graph looks like. So here's an example of how Mr. Klein might establish that present level of performance or that baseline. If he takes Taylor's median baseline score, which in this case was 5 items correct in 3 minutes, that gives him a good starting point for how to establish that long-term goal for Taylor. The next step for Mr. Klein is to really think about an ambitious long-term goal for Taylor. He really wants to make sure that he sets the goal as ambitious as possible. He knows that Taylor will work hard and rise to meet those expectations. And he also wants to continue to challenge himself to really make changes in instruction to help push Taylor to meet that long-term goal. How did he get an idea for how to establish this long-term goal? Well, he looked back at those benchmarks that were set as part of the algebra progress monitoring system, and then he picked, in this case, the spring goal. Okay, so here we are down in May. He picked the spring goal to set for Taylor, and then now he'll continue to progress monitor. That's the next step. He's going to collect frequent assessment data. So down here you see some data points that Mr. Klein has started to collect as part of his frequent progress monitoring of Taylor. I think that you're already probably looking at this graph and thinking about Taylor's data, looking at the trend line, and maybe comparing to goal line and understanding that at this point, looking at this data, Taylor is not on track to meet her long-term goal. And so this is important data because it helps Mr. Klein make further decisions about what needs to happen next. It also sort of prompts Mr. Klein to action. He's not going to wait any longer to make a change. He's looking at this data, and then it's sort of prompting him that he needs to get in there and make a change. So this moves to this next step, decision-making rules. After 2 8-week cycles of data collection, Mr. Klein finds that Taylor's progress is suggesting non-responsiveness. We really saw that in the graph before. She was pretty non-responsive after the first 8 weeks. He made a slight change, but now he wants to make sure that the data is really solid before he moves on. He's seen that after those couple of 8-week cycles, that she is in fact not responsive to the intervention that he's providing to her. His current decision-making rule for data is that if the trend of the data is below the goal line after 6 to 8 data points, he'll implement an instructional change. In our process in STAIR, we might be looking at and making changes in the data just slightly more frequently. So we might have a minimum of 4 data points that we're looking at before we go in and make a change. After this, Mr. Klein moves to the next steps in the process. So based on that student data, he continues, he has to make a decision about whether he'll continue the current programming, the Tier 2 programming, or if he'll actually collect some additional diagnostic data to make a different hypothesis and perhaps make a change in the instruction that's being provided. Given that Taylor has not been responsive, okay, I think we've seen that from that trend to Tier 2 instruction, Mr. Klein knows he needs to make a change in intervention. So his first step is to go back here to this diagnostic piece and really think about some additional data to determine where her skill deficits are. He might use the DOMA or the IARA that we're using as part of our project to determine where patterns are. He might also use error analysis from work samples that he currently has for Taylor. In any event, he's really thinking about how to collect that diagnostic data and then use that data to make a hypothesis and make a next step in a change for instructional change for Taylor. Based on the error analysis data that he collects and her patterns of errors on the computerized progress monitoring, Mr. Klein determines he needs to build in more fluency practice using fractions and also incorporate fraction practice using visual representations. We know fractions and learning of fractions is a key foundational element for our students, and it's pretty clear that Taylor needs some additional practice on fractions. He decides instead of doing the computerized intervention, which Taylor is currently working on independently, he decides to try to deliver the fraction practice to Taylor and a small group of other students in teacher-led instruction during a small group during that 20-minute intervention time. He's hoping this additional teacher time, teacher and student time, might also enhance her progress on her progress monitoring graph. Essentially, he's really hoping to boost her academic performance in mathematics. So here we see the incorporation of this intervention that I was just talking about. Mr. Klein actually indicates that he's making a change in instruction using this vertical line, and he's ready to start with intervention 2. He made this instructional change based on the hypothesis that Taylor needed more fraction practice using visual representations and more fluency practice with fractions. Now, he's going to see next how this intervention change is going to work for Taylor. Is she going to be successful? And then how will that be represented on the graph? So Mr. Klein continues to monitor Taylor's progress. This is the last step, step 5 in this DBI process. As you can see, things are not always smooth across the year. Mr. Klein continues to be extremely responsive to the data. He continues to use his decision-making rules, and he compares the trend line to the goal line and then makes a change in intervention as it's needed. And you can see his persistence over time. As he gets to the end of the year, Taylor is actually now on an upswing. She's on track and has actually exceeded her goal line for a couple of data points, but he'll want to continue to think about what program needs to be put in place for her in 7th grade during the next year. I hope this is giving you a better sense of what DBI might look like in practice with Mr. Klein and Taylor. Join us for our next tailored STAIR PD session on DBI.